Let's now see how we can access a physical disk or a partition on a physical disk from a VirtualBox virtual machine. So I have 3 drives on my Windows PC. I have the C drive, that's the main one that Windows is using, and then I have the D drive, which is the second partition on my internal disk, and then I have the E drive, which is an external disk. We can see the same thing from the disk management utility. So here we see the C and D drives on the internal disk and E, which is the external disk. An important thing to know is that the host and the guest should not access the same partition on the same time. You can do it, but it means that the virtual machine will only have read access, and if the data on the partition changes, the virtual machine won't be aware of these changes. So it's best avoided overall, and access to the partition should be exclusive. Either the host is to use it or the guest, but not both of them at the same time. It does mean that we're not going to give the guest access to the partition that's running the host operating system, but we are going to give it access to drive D and drive E. Notice that every disk has its number. C and D are on disk 0, whereas E is disk 1. We're going to use these ID numbers later on. Let's now open the Windows terminal. We must open it with administrator privileges. It won't work otherwise. We now need to change directory to the VirtualBox installation folder. The reason we had to change to this directory is that it contains a command called vboxmanage that we're going to use in a second. We now need to create a VMDK disk file, and this disk file will contain nothing but a link to the physical disk. So here goes. First, vboxmanage, internal commands, createrawvmdk. We now need to give a name to the disk file that we're creating, so dash file name and then the name of the file. And then the physical disk that we're linking to. Remember the numbers of the disks? That's where they come into play. So dash rawdisk and then physical disk followed by the number of the disk. Let's start with the E drive, which is the external disk. So the number is going to be 1. And the VMDK file was created. Let's now do the very same thing for the D drive. We will change the name of the file and the number of the physical disk. But there is a major difference between drive D and drive E. Drive E occupies the entire disk. Drive D, on the other hand, is a mere partition on the disk. As we said, we don't want the virtual machine to access drive C. So we don't want to give it access to the entirety of physical disk 0. Therefore, we're going to specify the partition. To find the partition, we're going to use the diskpart command line utility. Let's list the disks. And we can see here the same disk numbers we saw in the disk management utility. The D drive is on disk 0, so that's the disk we're about to choose. And now let's list the partitions. Using the size of the partitions and the type, we infer that drive D must be partition 4. So we can get back to the creation of the VMDK file and specify that the partition we want on the disk is partition 4. Great. Let's list the VMDK files. And we can see 3 of them. Notice that VirtualBox only needs 1 file to describe a disk, but to describe a partition within a disk, it needs 2 files. But if we look at the contents of the disk file, we can see that it links to the other file. The next thing we need to do is to make the 2 drives inaccessible to Windows, because we only want the virtual machine to be able to access them. Let's start with the partition, which is the D drive. It's a bit confusing, but in addition to the partition concept, Windows also uses the volume concept. And the number of a partition doesn't necessarily agree with the number of the volume, which means that we need to find the number of the volume separately. Let's list the volumes. And we can see that the volume of the D drive is volume 1. So that's the volume that we want to make offline. But before we can make it offline, we have to remove its letter. And now we can make volume 1 offline. Let's now set drive E to be offline as well. Since it's the entire disk, we don't care about volumes. Great. Let's now move the VMDK files to the folder of our virtual machines so we can load them. Notice that adding raw disks to a virtual machine requires administrator privileges. So we need to start VirtualBox as administrator. Let's now add the new disks to the virtual machine. And we can see the contents of the other partition on the internal disk, the one that was marked with D. And the contents of the external disk. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.